The wind atop the wall dragged at cloaks and breath and certainty, moaning its old, cold psalm against the ice. Jon Snow stood alone on the eastern crenellations with Ghost at his side, the direwolf's pale fur lifting and settling as if a snowdrift had learned to breathe. Below, the world fell away into a blank of night and frost. The torches along the ring wall of Castle Black guttered and flared, flung sideways by the gusts, their flames pressed thin like flags. Ghost's ears pricked. Jon felt the prickle crawl his own spine in answer, a wordless warning shared as easily as the taste of blood during a hunt. He turned his gaze north. A ragged sash of cloud stretched low above the haunted forest, its hem snagged on the tips of black pines. A star winked, vanished. Another followed. For a heartbeat the night drew a breath and did not exhale. It was not cloud that swallowed the stars. Something vast moved in the upper dark as a mountain might stir under snow. Even at that distance Jon felt the air change against his cheeks and teeth, pulling forward as if the sky had opened its mouth to drink. The torches along the wall yanked their flames toward the forest, an involuntary bow. Ghost gave the softest sound Jon had ever heard him make, not growl nor whine, recognition, or fear's first thought before it learned its name. He was not the only watcher. Boots thudded on the iceway behind him. Dolorous Ed came with his hood half collapsed over his brow, eyes narrowed against the wind. "I told Gren I'd only come up for fresh air," Ed said, peering into the night. "This isn't fresh so much as sharpened. I've been breathed on by knives." "Look," Jon said. He didn't point. He hardly dared to name anything about it, lest the naming call it near. Ed squinted, then stopped breathing altogether for a count of 3. "Ah," he said faintly, "a cloud without a belly. It's moving too fast for a cloud." Jon's voice sounded steadier than his gut felt. The thing veered, banked, a slow, sovereign turn that had nothing to do with wind. It hid and showed itself as if picking its path among invisible mountains. For a moment the moon slid free and drew a fringe of white fire along the curve of a wing. A wing and then another. The long tail wrote a pale sigil across the sky where frost in the air caught moonlight. Some old rune the world knew in its bones. Ed crossed himself with a gloved hand in 3 different religions. If 𝒍𝒂𝒔𝒕 asks, I'm praying, not cowering. Get Maester Aemon, Jon said. Wake him. Tell him the night remembers. Ed went because even his jokes could not find purchase on what moved above the treeline. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg. The direwolf's red eyes tracked the dark thing's passage until it folded itself into the eastern horizon, toward that broken place where ocean smoke drifted even in winter. When it was gone, the torches reclaimed their own flames and the sky remembered how to breathe. Only then did Jon realize his hand had found Longclaw's hilt and held it so long his knuckles ached. Maester Aemon came slowly but with purpose, as if the stairs had been years and not a spiral of carved ice. His cheeks were thin, his blind eyes milk blue and clear of doubt. He took the arm Jon offered, and Ed wrapped Aemon's cloak about him more closely. They stood leaning into the wind. Aemon lifted his face to the dark as if it had a voice only old blood could hear. Jon told what he had seen with no embellishment. Aemon listened with his head tilted, lips parted, as if catching a drift of music. When Jon finished, the old man's fingers worried at the cuff of his sleeve, smoothing frost that had gathered there. In the Red Keep, Aemon murmured, there are skulls the size of rooms, or there were. I saw them as a boy, when my feet knew the echo of that place. Those skulls belonged to kings of the sky, and the greatest was older than my memory and will outlast your bones, Jon Snow. Balerion, they called him, the Black Dread. Jon had heard the name. Every northern boy gave his breath to that legend at least once, telling it on winter nights while logs hissed and laughter tried for bravery. Balerion is dead, Jon said, as if the wall itself required the assurance. Dead? Aemon agreed gently, which was not the same as certain. Yet the world has been in the habit of late, of forgetting how to keep what it buries. Aemon lifted his face again. The wind worried at his hair. He could not see the sky, but something in him looked past it, farther. The first time I stood before that skull, I was smaller than one of its teeth. I put my hand into the hollow of its eye and felt old heat in the stone. They said he melted towers. They said he drank the light. It huffed, breath smoking. A skull is a skull. What's to drink? Sometimes, Eamon said, the cup is the world. They stood until the cold took possession of their joints. Jon carried the habit of command now without meaning to, shepherding the watchmen back to warmth, setting double sentries south as well as north, though no man suggested that any wall but this one mattered. Ghost did not leave Jon's shadow. When the dire wolf slept in Jon's small cell, the room felt as if it had grown a second heartbeat. A slow, heavy drum that kept measure against some march Jon could not hear. By dawn, rumor had outridden truth. Ragged men came to Castle Black from the fishing shacks east of the Milkwater, telling of the sea boiling as if a giant had set a kettle to it, of a streak of fire shot black and brazen across the night, of seals beaching themselves in panic and not remembering how to die. A wildling woman with a braid full of bone charms swore she had seen a mountain lift up and fly. Mountains fly when you're drunk, Ed told her. I don't drink, she said. Then we're doomed, Ed muttered to Jon. The first raven arrived by noon, beating its wings like a weary heart above the yard. It came from Eastwatch by the sea, Lord Tollet. Ed had inherited the title by knowing how not to refuse it, reported a shadow that crossed the moon, a rattle deep in the water like stones grinding their teeth, and the shore left fused and rippled where some heat had kissed it. The parchment crackled, faintly warm, as Jon rolled it closed. When Melisandre of Asshai come to Castle Black, she brought the smell of cinnamon and smoke, and a look under her eyelids like someone listening at a door only she could see. She had spent her prayers and Stannis iron on fires that did not melt this wall. She came to the hall with her red hair loosed from its gorget and a small smile that made Davos Seaworth, whose steady hands had known salt and storm and war without quaking, step half a pace back. I have dreamed, she said as she entered. Her voice was soft, and the room hushed for it. A mountain with wings came out of the sea. The shadow ate the moon. Men cowered from the dark, and the Lord of Light laughed, for even a shadow must take its form from fire. Stannis Baratheon sat as if carved, his jaw a line that could have leveled cities if clenched harder. He had brought his ambition north and found the wind indifferent. He left to others the business of marveling. Dreams, Stannis said. I want news. Sometimes they are the same, Melisandre said. She looked to Jon. Their eyes met and uneasiness crossed his skin like the shadow of a hawk. Tell me what you saw. A shadow in the sky, Jon said. More than a shadow, Eamon said quietly from the bench where he warmed his thin hands around a bowl. A memory made flesh, perhaps. Melisandre's red jewel pulsed at her throat as if a heartbeat had learned to dwell there. Names have power, she said. There are names that have burned so fiercely they have scorched the world itself. Speak a name so that it knows itself. No, Eamon said gently. Do not call what is already coming in its own time. But the name had already been whispered on a dozen tongues, in rumor and awe and trembling, and the world, being human, rarely kept silence where it could sing. Balerion. The next night, the sky cleared, that clean copper blue of winter that makes every star seem within reach, if your fingers would only learn cold. The watchers on the wall passed the horn between them without thinking to lift it. The torches thinned, then bent. Jon felt his ribs clench around his lungs and Ghost's warmth turn taut. He saw it first from the corner of his eye. The mind's trick with the impossible, pretending something so the heart could endure it. The trick failed. A shape vast and sure slid out of the heavens, blacker than their blackness, and every man who saw it understood in some unlettered part of himself that the world had only been pretending to be large until now. The dragon passed overhead and the ice under Jon's boots sang a high, fine note as if plucked. A smell came from it, not of smoke but of something older than smoke, an odor like iron and old rain and stone left a century in the sun. Balerion's belly crossed the moon, and the moon flinched. The dragon did not fly so much as choose where not to be. His wings pressed the night into shapes. His tail wrote in frost. He tilted, folding one great plane of wing, and every torch on the wall flickered in imitation. Then he was gone east, so fast that distance had not yet conjured itself to explain his vanishing. 7 hells, someone whispered, and the words felt half prayer, half surrender. A sign, Melisandre breathed. She stared into the dark with her hands open as if to catch falling light. Stannis' mouth thinned until it vanished. A weapon, he said. Aemon touched the table with his hand as if to find where would ended and ere began. A king, he whispered, and the words sounded not like a title but like a kind of weather. No man in Castle Black slept much that night. Jon lay awake with Ghost's head across his boots and tried to follow the echo of that great shape in his mind until it dissolved into memory and fear. He found himself thinking not of Stannis, nor of Melisandre's certainty, nor of any southern king, but of the stories old Nan had told back in Winterfell, of shadows cast by things too large to see, of names so heavy with telling that even saying them could bring snow off a roof. He slipped into sleep like a man stepping into a river. He dreamed of the crypts beneath Winterfell and the smell of damp earth and stone. He thought he heard bones shifting in their long beds, not in unrest but in courtesy, making room. In his hand in the dream he held a torch whose flame was dark, not bright. It smoked like oil and tasted of salt on his tongue. At the far end of the passage something breathed, slow and deep. The sound moved the dust where it lay on the old king's brows. He lifted the torch. The flame drew itself long and thin toward what breathed, as if hungry. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth and the knowledge that he had called a name without speaking. At dawn, a raven from Carhold brought word of snow that fell black for half an hour and turned white again, like an old scar healing. From Queen's Crown, word of horses panicking, bolting as if the wind had teeth. From Eastwatch, another message about heat. They had found a stretch of shore where the sand had fused to glass in a wave crest shape, a curl of frozen foam rendered in glossy black. Jon ran his hand over the description as if it were the thing itself. Proof, Stannis said, satisfied without smiling. Of what? Davos asked. Of a promise, Melisandre answered for him. 3 days later, when the cold held even the ravens in their airy cages, the dragon came down upon the fist of the first men and unburied it from its own legend. Scouts brought the tale like men bringing a fire inside their rib cages. The others had gathered there, a congregation of white and blade and stillness. Their cold lay on the stones like judgment. The sky went black where no cloud went. Something bent the light. Balerion fell out of the withheld night like a sentence coming to its period. His shadow covered the fist, and every living thing forgot how to move. When his fire came, it did not flare gold or red. Came black, which is to say it came so hot that the air could not decide how to show it. The snow vanished so swiftly it made steam that had weight. It fell and rolled and was devoured by itself. The ice under the others' feet sighed and ran. Blue swordlight broke like glass. Where the dragon's breath touched stone, the stone remembered what it meant to be liquid. For a heartbeat, the fist took the shape of a wave. The others fled without turning. Balerion climbed on the updraft of his own heat, flying as if the world were something he had invented and could edit at pleasure. He banked once, showing the pale fire along the edges of his membranes, then went north into an old night. No horn could have sounded louder. Word ran the realm without tiring. In King's Landing, a queen with a mouth like a cut bent to stare into a skull bigger than her childhood home and saw in the sockets not emptiness but a reflection of the dark beyond her window. She reached out a hand. The bone was cold. Her breath, though, wreathed it warm, and for a moment she thought the skull drank that warmth. Qyburn watched with eyes that estimated what it would cost to make a myth work. In Meereen, a young woman with a name older than most wars climbed to her pyramid's wind and watched her black dragon roll and snap, proud and volatile as summer lightning. He was mighty. He was hers. He was not that whatever it was dwarfed even pride. Drogon screamed, and the sound seemed smaller than it had ever been. Daenerys did not sleep. Her dreams were all wings with the sun torn small between them, and a man on a back she barely saw, and a direwolf running along a line of snow that did not end. In the morning she fed her dragons herself and spoke no prophecies aloud. At the wall, Melisandre built her fire on the yard's packed snow and laid out her glossolalia like knives. Stannis stood near and scowled into the flames as if they owed him taxes. Davos' weathered hands remained folded behind his back. Aemon sat close enough to feel the heat but not enough to let it undo him. Jon watched because the world had become a chamber of attention. "Azor Ahai," Melisandre said into the roar as if to a lover. "Listen." The fire did not answer in a tongue men spoke, but it made shapes within shapes. Jon had learned not to trust the things eyes do when they want what they think is being offered. Still, he could not help seeing. A sword lifted against blackness. A man small against the back he rode. Snow that made of itself a road. He saw a skull crack down the center, and from the crack something like smoke but heavier, rising. He did not admit any of it aloud. That night a different dream came, like a door opening in a wall he had never found before. He stood in Winterfell's crypts again, but these were not quiet or sorrowful. They were awake. The old king's carved direwolves looked down and did not condemn. A heat breathed up from the dark, a steady bellow stroke. "Come," said a voice, not in his ears but in his bones, and he did not know how to refuse. He went with Ghost through the cold, into a tunnel he had not known existed, where water sang in stone throats and the air tasted of iron and old ash. The passage widened. The heat grew until his cheeks flushed like a boy running. When the tunnel opened, the space beyond was cathedral vast and alive. Cracks webbed the stone ceiling, glittering. Runnels of water steamed and hissed. In the center, curled as if guarding some egg older than the world, lay something black and immense and at peace. The eye opened, not red, not gold. It was the color of a forge after a long night, a dark that remembers light from the inside. It looked at him the way winter looks at men, without haste, without malice, with certainty. Jon's knees wanted the floor. Ghost's lips pulled back silently over his teeth. The dragon lifted his head. Stone dust rain fell off his brows like shed years. Balerion's breath rolled across Jon's face and took his breath away. It smelled of thunder and hot iron and salt. Jon reached up his hand without deciding to, the way a man reaches to pet a horse while telling himself he is only testing the air. His palm found scale hard as a king's promises. The heat beat into his hand and threw it into his arm and chest. He felt spine and heart answer, an echo as old as blood. He had thought the wall taught him cold, but he had never known heat not like this. He woke in his own bed with his hand stinging and the smell of salt unexplainably in his hair. Ghost paced, restless and disbelieving. Jon's palm, when he looked, bore a new map of reddened lines where his skin had kissed something too hot to permit. At first light, he made his way to Maester Aemon. He did not bother trying to be subtle. The old man wore the morning like a well, still and deep. Jon told him. Aemon listened faster than young men often speak. "If you kneel to anything," Aemon said at length, "let it be to truth, but take care what shape you tell it to wear. The world is too ready to fall in love with its own stories." "I felt him," Jon said, angry that doubt should even be expected of him. "I do not doubt that," Aemon murmured. He lifted Jon's hand in his own like a bird he meant to examine without frightening. He traced the thin red lines with a fingertip. "You touched him or he touched you, which is closer to the way old things work." "Why me?" Jon asked and hated how young he heard himself sound. "You ask the question every boy asks in a new body," Aemon smiled. He became grave again as quickly. "Tell no one who will try to fit you into their prophecy. Fire loves to be told a story about itself. It burns the better for being praised. But men who praise it may wish to hold your hand in the flames to prove a point." "I'll tell Stannis," Jon said, and had the odd thought that he was putting his hand into a lion's mouth to learn if it had grown teeth yet. Stannis listened with suspicion, which he wore more comfortably than any cloak. "A dream," he said once Jon had finished. "I woke with a burn," Jon answered, showing his hand. "Men wake with wounds from dreams if they thrash against bedposts," Stannis said. I've done it myself. The bruise proves only that what exists. Let us prove more, Melisandre said softly. Let us go where the dream calls. Stannis did not like the flavor of words he had not ordered to be spoken. Where? He demanded. South, Melisandre said. She looked at Jon, then past him, as if something stood in the door behind him listening. Winterfell. Stannis' mouth twitched as if at some old hurt. Yes, he said. Winterfell. They went under banners that forgot how to flap, stiff with cold as old opinions. The road south along the gift lay chalked with hoarfrost. The company moved like a slow wound under gray light. Davos kept their pace and counsel. The king radiated impatience like a small fire that refuses larger wood. The Red Woman rode without seeming to touch saddle or reins. Ghost ran ahead, then back, winding the column like a pale thread through a loom. When night came, the fires made small islands in a sea of frost. Jon slept in fits and woke with the feeling of something vast waiting under the world, patient as stone. Winterfell received them as it receives winters, with stone and silence and the smell of smoke. The hot springs threaded the halls like veins that remembered warmth. Snow clung in the inner yards where the warmth did not reach, powdering the black iron of the gates. The godswood held itself aloof and red. The heart tree watched them all with that inhuman quiet grief the old gods share with dogs. Stannis took the great hall as if it had been meant, though it had never meant him. He looked up at the banners of the direwolf and felt nothing that showed. He allowed his courtesy to the memory of Eddard Stark with a small inclination that might have been respect and might have been habit. The kitchens began the business of turning stores into meals. Aemon sat by a flue that shared its breath with him. Melisandre moved through the place as if listening for a music she had heard once as a girl outside any door. Jon went straight to the crypts with Ghost for shadow. He carried a torch that belonged to no prophecy and a sword that had belonged to a man who died in a snowstorm and left behind a kindness. The air in the crypts felt like winter that forgave. He walked past kings he had not been raised to name, their direwolves carved with patient mouths. He felt foolish. He felt that he should have known better. He went anyway. The last turn, the torch leaning, the flame stooping to taste the damp in the air. The floor dipped and then grew warm underfoot, subtly at first, then surely, like a hand smoothing over a rough board until it learned the grain. Ghost stood still with every hair lifted as if a second ghost had put himself on top of the first. The old stones breathed. Jon snuffed the torch before it went out in pride. In the dark, the warm air gave him a map of the shape of the world without sight. He spoke no name. He did not have to. The sound came as it had in the dream. A fill and empty, a fill and empty, like the forge bellows of a god. Light without light lifted itself behind the deeper dark. The heat grew a face. The face opened an eye. Jon did not kneel. He stood, thin and mortal and stubborn as a nail, and lifted his hand the way a child holds out an apple to a skittish mare. Something impossibly heavy lowered into the shape of that gesture. His palm met a plate of scale ridged like a range of hills. Beneath it, power thrummed, no power breathed. The old kings in stone seemed to turn their heads, merely to grant privacy to their descendant and what had come. When he climbed, he did not think to ask permission, for permission had already been given long before there were men to ask and give. He set his foot in the seam of plates where the muscle rolled like a storm under black skin. His other leg came after of its own will. He found a ridge that fit his thighs as if his body had been carved by its edges in the womb. He leaned forward. He did not say go. They went. Afterward, he could not have said how the dragon cleared the stone above, only that stone yielded as if it had been waiting centuries to oblige. The world tilted. The smell of earth became the smell of air, and then the smell of cold so clean it seemed like a taste you could bite. Balerion's wings filled the crypt and broke it open like a shell. Winterfell shook itself like a dog out of water, and the gods would bowed though no wind touched it. Men staggered in the yard. Stannis reached for a sword he could not use against the sky. Melisandre's mouth opened in a laugh so small he might have dreamed it. Ymon turned his face toward the sound, not because he could see, but because he had learned to listen for miracles when they came in the wrong shape. Balerion rose out of Winterfell with the ease of memory. He carried Jon as if he were a thought in his head, and the thought were this: fly. The keep fell away, and the roofs, and the fields, and the world. The dragon's heat came up through Jon's legs and chest and jaw into his skull, until it filled him with something that was not steam and not pride and not fear, but a residue of all three. Ghost watched them go until they were small and then not small, running along the inner Bailey wall to keep them in his eye as long as there was an eye to keep. He had thought flying would be like falling, only with a longer scream. It was not. It was the chest-opening feeling you get before the scream considers whether it might be joy. The air slid past like silk, then grabbed, then let go, and each letting go taught Jon trust in a new language. He clung, and then he remembered he did not need to cling. He moved with the muscle under him the way a man moves his hand on a horse's neck to say to the horse, "We both know what this is." They ran the line of the wall like a knife across the wrist of the world. Watchfires went guttering in their wake. Men lifted spears and forgot to lower them again. Balerion pitched, and Jon's stomach stayed behind for a moment like a faith he had not brought with him, then found him again. He laughed once, because there was no reason not to, and the laugh ripped the cold and went sideways, torn. Under them, the haunted forest lay like a pelt. They saw tracks the size of barns pressed into drifts where ice giants had trudged. They saw the black rope of the milk water dragging itself slow under a scab of ice and then losing the argument. They saw farther north a light moving that was not light but a refusal of it. Balerion turned his head, and Jon felt the interest pass through him, mild as weather. The dragon did not hunt that light now. It was not time. When they returned, the world felt incorrectly sized. Jon's own legs seemed too small for walking. He slid down Balerion's shoulder and hit the earth with the awkward joy of a man who has just learned to walk twice. Stannis came toward him quick as he could without running. He stopped at a distance words could cross but not hands. "You have a dragon," Stannis said, flat as a map. Jon found that his tongue had to relearn his mouth. "He found me." "Names?" Melisandre said, stepping forward as if to curtsy to the dark of the dragon. "Know where they belong." Balerion placed one foot down inside the yard as if to rest that yard in his palm. The stone acknowledged the weight like an old friend come home suddenly with a taste for chairs. Steam wreathed from the seams in the dragon's armor where warm air found cold. Men and women clustered in the doors like thoughts unwilling to commit. Only Ymon came forward past sense, groping the air until his fingers found not flesh but warmth. "I never thought I would feel this again," he said. He smiled without showing his teeth, or perhaps he had none to show. "Heat that is not a hearth." Balerion lowered his head, not bowing, merely allowing the world to share a room. Jon stood between the dragon's jaw and the men who would make prayers or laws out of what they saw. "Who taught you?" Stannis asked. "How to?" He made a motion with his hand, as if shooing a fly that weighed 40,000 pounds. "No one," Jon said. "Convenient," Stannis said, meaning dangerous. "We should test what he can do against the true enemy," Davos said softly. "There's use and then there's glory, and I've not seen good come of the second more than once." Melisandre's eyes had gone deep, reflecting something Jon could not see. "The Lord of Light has returned a weapon we thought the world had swallowed. Or the world has coughed up its bone," Ymon said, and his old smile seemed to know some joke darker and truer than prophecy. If winter had been a chessboard before, it turned now into a game where all the pieces could fly. Scouts returned with impossible speed. The Night King, if that was what he was, and the world had a way of giving simple names to complicated harms, moved slower than fear. He gathered at the places where the wind had learned to howl too well. He did not care about men's roads. He cared about the shape of cold in the land like a net. He cast it. Things died in the mesh and did not leave. Balerion flew each night, sometimes with Jon, sometimes alone. When Jon rode him, he learned small things that did not feel small. How to shift his shoulders to ask the dragon not to tear a village when they rose from it. how to lean to give Balerion permission to trust the wind coming off the wall and rise on it like a hawk, how to grip not with his knees but with every part of a man that can learn to be a hinge. He learned to listen for the lintel note of the dragon's purr. Yes, dragon's purr. It is not a sound for houses. He learned too the limits of fire. On a night so clear it might have been made of glass. He and Balerion came down upon a lake where ice had learned to seem bottomless. The dead stood at the far shore in ranks as neat as a parson's cupboards. Balerion breathed, and the world forgot what water meant. The first rank fell and did not rise. The second walked over them. Jon saw that you can burn 100 and 1,000 more will come, as if cold breeds faster than rabbits. He felt the sharp despair he had known the first time he saw the wall from the top. The understanding that this was not a fight you won, only a fight you must not lose. From Meereen came a second wind. Word that Daenerys Stormborn had set sail at last, her fleet a ragged, stubborn mouthful of hulls biting the sea. She brought dragons that were hers. Men argued in the hall about whether dragons can be multiplied like torches, as if you could put 3 next to 1 and expect a need for. Aemon shook his head slightly at the arithmetic of it. Stannis listened because he knew that even numbers lie. On the second day after Jon's first flight, a ship with black sails and long knives on its prow slid silent into the anchorage at Eastwatch. Its captain had one blue eye and one that looked like the night had forgotten to remember itself. He had a horn as long as a man's arm laid in a black chest lined with flensed leather. He called himself Euron and King, sometimes one before the other, and smiled like a blade catching a thin line of light. He came to Winterfell under truce because he liked the taste of truce when there was war to salt it. He showed Stannis his horn. The glyphs carved along it seemed to move if you looked too long, the way ants seem to change their mind when you carry sugar past them. They say this calls dragons, Euron said. They say it costs something to blow. What horn does not? What does it cost? Jon asked because he had learned to count before he had learned to speak. A man, Euron smiled as if offering a coin. But whose? That's the only question worth asking. Stannis' eyes went to the horn and stuck there, as if the black lines were a map to a place he had mistakenly thought he'd already reached. We don't deal with demons, Davos said, and meant horns and kings and both. Melisandre tilted her head. The Lord of Light needs no horn to call what belongs to fire. Still, Stannis began. No, Jon said. He surprised himself by how even he kept his voice. He's not a dog. Euron's blue eye shone like a cold sun. The night eye did nothing at all, which is a kind of doing. Ah, he said. So it's yours to command already, or you belong to it. Does it matter which? Come, boy. You sit a black chair without a back. Try mine. It has spikes and a view.
Ide suone sit onastum, Jonan suarat.
Many kings have, Euron said, as if confessing a secret. He set the horn down as if it weighed dreams. I'll blow it when the day is right, and we shall see whose names are truer. Blow it, and the man who blows dies, Davos said flatly. Having watched the way Euron's thrall kept his gaze fixed on nothing and held himself too carefully, like a puppet who knows it is seen. Some men die to raise bridges, Euron said. Bless them. He left, smiling as if he'd bought something he had not asked for. Jon watched him go and felt the way you do when a fox leaves your henhouse still smiling. He thought about horns and bridges. He did not tell Balerion not to come when called. That was not how you spoke to kings. When Daenerys came ashore at White Harbor, Winter licked her ankles through her boots and she lifted her chin and bore it. The white people gave her fish and silence and 1,000 kinds of scrutiny. Tyrion Lannister brought his cleverness and weariness, both in ample store, and remembered to smile at children. Missandei watched the cold with that deep intelligence she turned upon every new word. Grey Worm counted exits. Varys breathed carefully to keep his breath from becoming too much of a cloud. Drogon landed on the low cliff outside the city and made a sound that turned every head in 3 counties. Rhaegal came sluggishly afterward, and Viserion sang his thin, sweet song to the snow as if to persuade it that it meant no harm. They rode north. They saw the wall, which is not an argument but an ending. They came to Winterfell uneasy and proud and hopeful and afraid. Daenerys looked up and saw the black shape on the tower above the gate and stood her ground as if pride were armor. Jon came to meet her in the yard below the fall of old banners, with Ghost ranging to and fro, and everyone who mattered to the fate of the world stood within reach of each other's breath. Tyrion saw Jon and smiled with something like sorrow. He had been a boy once at Winterfell, before the sky remembered what else it could have been. He bowed his head to Jon and then raised it to study the black shadow on the tower. Balerion lifted his head and looked at Drogon. The yard went quiet as a held breath. Drogon flared his wings in a low, boiling proclamation that said, "I am alive and I am mine and I have flown long places you cannot imagine." Balerion did not answer. He merely was. That was enough. After a moment, Drogon lowered his head without shame but with recognition, as a young lord lowers his eyes when his grandsire enters a hall carrying Winter at his back. Daenerys watched that exchange with a cool that did not dig its nails into any skin not its own. She turned to Jon. "You ride him," she said, and it was not a question. "I do," Jon said. "You have never set foot in Valyria," she said, which stated a fact she could not have known but believed anyway. "You were not raised under dragons' eyes. You were not taught the words we use for them." "No," Jon said. "I should hate you," she said in a voice too quiet to carry. "I find that I don't." Her smile was a small, sad knife. "That is inconvenient." "It is," Jon admitted, surprised by how relieved he felt at the joke of it. "Then we are kin," she said, and something almost like warmth brushed his cheek as she stepped past him. "And we will behave as strangers until we must do otherwise." They did not have long to pretend estrangement. The dead marched and they did not tire. Winter broke and broke and broke upon men until men remembered they were water as much as bone. They came to bring fire to end cold and found that fire has its own hunger. The first battle they fought together was not truly a battle. It was a rescue at Hardhome, where fishermen and mothers with children on their backs and men with bad teeth and good eyes waited in a huddle under a cliff and watched the blue horizon deliver their unmaking. The fleet could not reach them all in time. The dead came in a slow surge like a tide that believed in itself too much. Snow fell as if it were hurrying to be part of what the world meant from now on. Jon mounted Balerion and Daenerys climbed to Drogon. They met the air as if it had been an old tryst reawakened. They crossed and recrossed above the shore, carving lanes with flame for men to run and live in. Rhaegal and Viserion wove pale, emerald heat into the black lattice where Balerion burned. The sea threw the steam back into their faces. Men fell and rose and fell again. All of it was too big for hands. And then the Night King came to look. He did not walk. He did not ride. He arrived as if the cold had opened and offered him up. His eyes took the shape of the same sky everyone else saw and turned it wrong side out. He raised his arm, and a spear of black ice coalesced in the air as if daring water to remember its sharpest self. He pulled back like a hunter testing his elbow. Balerion turned his head in the same motion that Jon leaned. They climbed, and the spear hissed beneath, kissing a taste of air where Jon's leg had been a half heartbeat before. The Night King did not hurry. He did not need to. He had time and silence and a world full of water to set hard. Drogon screamed and went at him like the first sin. Balerion followed by not following, flanking as if the air were a field. The Night King's second spear found Rhaegal's wing and stitched it to the light. Rhaegal faltered, snarled, tore the ice with a convulsion and limped his way skyward, bleeding steam. Daenerys banked and rose, trusting angles she could not see. The Night King reached for another spear from nothing, and Balerion breathed. Black fire met the cold where the Night King stood. The world made a sound like iron left too long in water and dragged out by its lazy weight. Steam rose not white but dark, a fume smoke that felt like heat turned in on itself, a negative of flame. The Night King stepped through it and his shoulders smoked and his carved calm slipped a fraction. Jon felt the attention of that face turn toward him, and this was like being looked at by the bottom of the sea. "Again," Jon said, though he had not learned to give commands to mountains. Balerion's chest rose and fell, and the air righted itself, and black flame came. The Night King lifted his arm, and the ice in his hand folded around the breath like a glove around a river. It hissed and thrashed and could not remember its own name. When the flames peeled off, the Night King stood unpretty and less sure. He turned not to flee but to reevaluate the arithmetic of the world and found it still in his favor. They did not kill him that day. They pushed back the dead far enough for boats to load and set off. Spines of men and women and fear bent over oars. They burned the cliff and melted it and made it into a different danger. They lived. That is what they accomplished. Sometimes you praise the day by not being dead in it. Jon slept the night after as if sleep were a force that had to be wrestled. He dreamed of the crypt beneath the Red Keep where skulls watched kings make the worst mistakes they could think of, stone having learned patience from men's folly. He dreamed that Balerion's skull cracked down its middle, the bone flaking like cold bread. From the crack came heat, and from the heat came a sound of old laughter, not cruel, just vast. He woke with the taste of ash and wine as if he had been drinking in a city made of knowing. When the dawn came, a raven brought news. In King's Landing, a crack had appeared in the skull of Balerion, the Black Dread. The queen had gone to stare, and the maester had made a sound like a man who had dug his own grave and found it already occupied. "That will make her generous," Tyrion said dryly when he heard. "A crack in her certainty." He looked up at the real Balerion wheeling over the yard and did not say aloud, "And the rest of us as well." The horn came again, and this time it blew. Euron had chosen his man from among those who did not understand choice. The fellow's lips were already cracked and bleeding from some older debt when they pressed to the black mouth. He blew and the sound tore his throat open. It was not a note so much as a decision. It went out across leagues in no time at all because it did not travel by distance but by want. Fires snapped in hearths and dimmed. Children woke and reached for mothers who could not name what had passed over them. In Old Town, the Hightower's lamps flickered and the maesters forgot their arguments for 2 whole heartbeats and then remembered them doubled. Balerion stopped in the air and turned as if the word had called him by his old name. Jon felt the pull as he might feel a tide in his blood. He put his hands against the great neck under his knees. "No," he said, a man to a storm. "No." Balerion did not answer. He steepened his wing and turned south, gathering the world into the curve of his body. Jon bared his teeth as a man does when the horse he rides decides that this fence will be jumped and no other. He leaned forward until his mouth was at the place where scale met scale. "No," he said again, and then more softly, "Please." Heat came into his thighs and belly, and up his spine and behind his eyes. It was not the dragon's anger. It was the dragon's attention. A city might feel like this if a god walked its streets. Jon shut his eyes and let the heat wash him, not fighting it, who fights the sea, but not letting it carry him wholly either. He thought of the wall. He thought of Ghost's fur under his fingers the night he had first left Winterfell. He thought of Samwell's bravery where any other man would claim fear. He thought of old Aemon's hand on his, blind fingers finding truth by the patient method of touch. He thought of Ned Stark's silence and how full of love it had been all along. He thought, "I am not yours. I am yours. We belong to each other. If we go because we choose it, not because a horn tells us how to die." Balerion's heat filled him so that the edges of the world went soft. He felt a resistance like a great muscle flexing against a chain beneath the surface of the sea. He felt that chain tighten, then groan. He felt it give, coolness seeping where it had cut. Balerion shuddered once like a horse shaking flies. The horn's note failed not because breath ran out, though it did, but because the sound broke itself on something older than sound. The man who had blown it dropped dead with his heart torn out of labor he had not known he was doing. Euron stood over him and smiled that thin, sincere smile of his. He looked up into a sky that did not bring him what he was owed and nodded, as if to an old friend who had crossed the room not to embrace him but to burn his ships. "Fair," he said. "We shall see." The crack in the skull at the Red Keep widened, and flakes of bone fell and powdered the floor like a pretense at snow. Cersei Lannister watched stone admit it at last. that even kings die. She had to sit down. She did not call for wine. She did not speak. Qyburn stood like a man in church waiting to see which god arrived. Winter fought itself and men in equal measure. Armies assembled and found that snow is a better general. The dead came on in a white that made edges disappear. It is hard to be brave when you cannot tell where you end and the world begins. The living answered with cleverness and fire and the stubbornness of hearts that had decided not to end. Not here, not now. The last battle in the north did not happen where old stories would have placed it. Not at the wall, not at Winterfell, but on a wide white plain east of the weeping water where the wind made a keening old women do when no one helps them to the grave. The Night King stood in the center of his patience and watched. Men came around him like a slow storm. Dragons made the air into a geometry of heat. The dead did not stop. They learned. That was the worst of it. They learned from fire like any living thing. Balerion came down from the sky like a night falling on a city. Drogon screamed in exultation at his flank. Regal limped the air. Viserion's thin song cut like wire. The whites raised their hands and the frost reached back. On the plain's far side Bran Stark sat in a sledge like a boy on a river, and his eyes were somewhere else entirely. He had gone to the ravens and beyond them. He flew with them and through them, and then for a little while, because the world had seen stranger, he flew with Balerion. It is a terrible thing to be inside a god, even if the god allows you there out of amusement or grace. Bran felt heat as information. He felt Jon as a word the dragon had been learning to pronounce. He felt the Night King's cold not as a temperature but as an argument. That endings are kinder than continuances, that stillness is peace, that the world would be less tormented if it would simply agree to be still and white and conclude. He went deeper. He saw an old city drowned in green fire and black water and remembered dragons screaming above it an age ago. He saw a young man with silver hair place his hand on the brow of a dragon and whisper a name that changed a continent. He saw once a skull on a wall in a keep and a boy crane his body small enough to fit his hand inside the hollow of that skull's eye. He felt the skull cracking now. He felt, for a single beat, the world's agreement that this was right. What dies ought to show it outside as well as in. He came back into himself and looked out through his borrowed raven's eyes and saw Jon on Balerion's back turning to find the Night King through the steam and snow. He saw Daenerys on Drogon's back fighting with a ferocity that was both mercy and rage in the same breath. He saw Arya run like a knife. He saw Sansa on the ridge with the archers, not pretending to be anything but what she was, a woman who had learned to count and to do multiplication with men's lives when necessary. He saw Theon hold when most men would have broken. He saw Samwell stab and cry and not stop moving. He saw men he did not know die and die and die, and he refused to look away. The Night King lifted his hand and the dead lifted with it, jerking like fish on a line from the river where life had forgotten them. Bran sent his birds into the eyes of men who faltered and steadied them with the knowledge that they were not unseen, that someone counted their steps and did not reduce them to a number. He gave Jon and Daenerys and the dragons the one gift he had left: directions. He put into their minds, gentle as a hand lifting a cup, a sense of where the cold thinned, where the Night King's certainty fed from a spring. It lay under the snow, under the plain, an old place where the ground remembered being fire and longed for it. Jon pressed his calves to Balerion and they went down. The Night King watched without visible interest, but interest is not the same as attention. He drew a spear and did not throw it yet, waiting for the cleverness of the living to show him where it hurt most to strike. Daenerys came screaming as she came into every room that had ever tried to tell her no. The Night King lifted his face and watched her as if observing weather. They hit the ground hard enough that the snow lifted in a ring around them and fell back as if reconsidering itself. Jon slid from the dragon's back with his feet already running. He ran through steam and froth and men's shouts until the sounds lost their shapes and became a single bright line of need. He ran to where Bran had said the ground was thin. It looked like nothing at all. It looked like everywhere else. He plunged Longclaw into the snow and hit stone, and the stone rang as if it remembered music. He fell to his knees and put both hands down and shouted over his shoulder without thinking, the way a man shouts for a friend to pass him a tool he has always used. Now, Balerion lowered his head. The heat in Jon's bones rose in answer as if the dragon breathed through him from the inside out. The dragon hammered his breath into the earth. The snow melted and then sublimed, and then the stone itself gave. Steam rose like a living thing. The smell of old salt and iron and the inside of the world rolled out and knocked men backward. A vent opened, a round mouth sipping at the sky, and inside it burned a hotter dark. The Night King lifted his arm at last to throw. Drogon struck him from the side, not with fire, that had not worked well enough, but with the full force of his body, shoulder into certainty, as if to prove that even cold can be moved with enough will and meat. The Night King staggered one step, and that step mattered more than anything he had done or failed to do in 1,000 years. Jon, on his knees, hauled himself up by the edges of the vent he had made and screamed wordlessly across the plain and the steam and the years. He called no name. He invited. Balerion answered. The dragon put his face into the earth's wound and exhaled the kind of breath men write lies about when they want to make boys into soldiers. The vent answered with a column of heat that had waited centuries for permission. For a moment there was no world but rising fire and falling cold, and a cry that may have come from the dead or the living or the dragon or the stone. Then it was over. The shock threw men to their knees. The wave of altered air knocked whites like cut grain. Where the Night King had stood, ice lay in shards like discarded knives. The air above it bent, brightened, and then did not. The dead collapsed into themselves with a sound like old rugs being beaten. They did not rise. Snow began to fall because snow does not care for a narrative. No one cheered, not at first. Men panted and sobbed and looked around as if expecting some second act, some confirmation that what they had just done would be allowed to stand. Then someone, a boy with a broken tooth and a mother's scarf tied around his arm, let out a noise that was more weeping than shout. Others joined, fumbling for joy the way you fumble with a belt at dawn when your hands are still asleep. It became a cheer because men need endings. Jon stood with his arms hanging as if someone had borrowed his strength and forgotten to return it. Balerion turned his head to look at him, and what passed between them was older than pride. Daenerys slid from Drogon's back and stood beside Jon without touching him. They breathed together a while, earning each breath in the old way. In King's Landing the cracked skull gave up another flake, and it fell and fell and fell and took with it the last of some idea of invulnerability a queen had dressed herself in every morning. She sat very straight and listened to the silence that follows a song when you had not known you'd been listening. "So," she said to no one, "so that is done. War remained because war remains even when the enemy worth the name is dust. Men remembered grievances, knives remembered backs, old letters remembered seals and signatures that had been meant. The North did not forget that Southern crowns had often meant hunger for Northern throats. The South did not embrace that dragons had decided the arithmetic of the North without asking a tally. Even friends became anxious when they looked up and saw the black wheel of a dragon write its calm on their sky. They met in Winterfell's hall. The long tables had seen 1,000 dinners and more arguments than those dinners suggested. The old ash smell had been joined by a taste of salt and something like iron. Sansa sat where courtesy placed her. Arya leaned against the wall like a shadow, thinking about where else it might like to be. Bran watched everything at once and something else besides. Tyrion lounged and measured laughter against cost. Davos, who had seen kings die and boats burn and boys try to be men too quickly, watched the door. Jon stood most times because sitting felt like lying now that he'd learned how large the world could be when you let it. "Someone must rule," Sansa said in a voice that had found steel under its patience. "Someone is ruling," Daenerys said evenly. "I am. Or, if your North must prove clever, say that we rule together." Stannis said nothing. He said it like a man taking the better hill. Melisandre watched Jon and Daenerys as if watching the Lord of Light tell a joke she was not sure he should be telling. Jon looked at the faces he loved and the faces he had learned to respect and the faces he would never trust regardless. He saw a throne in his mind and Balerion melting it the way he had melted stone on the plain, not as a boast but as an end to an argument. He thought of Eamon's hand on his burned palm and the old man's quiet voice. "Take care what shape you tell truth to wear." "The throne was forged by dragonfire," Jon said. "It gave men the idea that they could put all their fear and hope in a chair. Chairs are poor at such business." Daenerys looked at him and saw something she had not wanted to see. That he would choose the thing she feared he would. He would choose less. He would choose to say no to what she had said yes to for so long that it had become her name. "What do you want?" she asked. It was the only honest question worth talking over in any hall. "Peace," Jon said, and heard how thin that sounded because peace is not a thing you want. It is a currency, and you buy it with everything you have and then borrow besides. "I want fewer graves. Then sit the throne and keep men from digging," Tyrion said, very mild. "If no one sits it, a worse man will. Or a better woman," Sansa said without smiling. "We break it," Jon said. The hall did not break into noise. It held its breath as it had held so many swords. "Break it with what?" Stannis asked, purely curious. "Fire," Jon said. Daenerys had never looked more queenly than when she did not argue. She stood. She turned. She left the hall not as a retreat, but as a woman going to fetch the tool necessary for the thing a man has finally had the courage to say aloud. They took no crowd to the Red Keep. They took the people who would be able to tell the story without granting it too much and without selling it too cheap. They took Aemon because old men deserve to see old mistakes righted. They took Davos and Tyrion because someone had to remember the cost, and those were men who counted. They took Sansa and Arya and Bran because the North needed eyes on the thing the South had believed it owned. They took Melisandre because she had married her certainty to this work, and it is unkind to leave a bride at the door. They took the Hound because someone had to guard the door against men who would set the whole thing on fire less well. Cersei received them as a woman receives a flood in her dining room. She did not forbid entry. She did not bless it. She stood with her hands clean and her wine unpoured and looked at the black dragon that settled upon the shattered square where the sept had been. She did not flinch. She had run out of flinching. Balerion lowered his head and looked into the hall through the broken outer wall, and his eye filled the space where men had made their sins into furniture. The skull lay in its niche, cracked like old pottery. Aemon went to it, slowly, as if to an old friend who had wronged him by dying and then apologized by letting a boy put his hand in his eye. He laid his palm on the bone and whispered something no one else heard. He smiled, and then he cried a little quietly, the way old men do. Jon stood below the throne, and for a moment the sword points caught light like sequins sewn on a cruel dress. He thought of all those blades once held in hands that had been warm. He thought of the smith who had made the nails that held a farmer's door. He thought of Balerion in another age, pouring his breath over a heap of steel to baptize it into symbol. "Do it," Jon said. Daenerys climbed to Drogon, even though the job did not belong to Drogon. He screamed and the room shook, and Cersei swallowed, a small, involuntary movement that admitted she lived in a body. Balerion turned his head and exhaled, slow as a tide. The chair made of swords remembered it was made of swords, and then it remembered it had always been, and then it remembered that everything in the world wants to be something else. Steel ran. Fire took it. The throne slumped and wept and then ceased to be anything but heat and ruin. Cersei did not scream. She stood and watched her life's argument melt. "Good," she said dully. "Now the rats will have nowhere golden to gnaw." Tyrion's mouth pulled sideways. "They will find a substitute." He touched Jon's arm. "All you have done is make the next man who sits a chair perform two miracles. First to find a chair, and second to convince men he belongs there." Daenerys slid down and stood beside Jon. They did not hold hands. Their shoulders were so close they could have shared breath had they chosen. "And now?" she asked. "Now we rule without pretending a chair makes us right," Jon said. "Now we argue in halls we can rebuild if we burn them down with our speeches." Melisandre's jewel pulsed once, twice, like a satisfied heart. Aemon leaned on his stick and laughed a small laugh. "To be old," he said, "and see a thing unmade that should never have been made, it almost makes one trust time." The years that followed did not decide to be kind simply because men had learned how to end one story well. The world held. Men held it. They made mistakes specific to themselves rather than general to their species. That is better, if not best. The North kept its winter and its pride and learned new languages for the old word guest. The South found that wine tastes better when not drunk in fear. The narrow sea remained narrow, and dragons remained themselves. Jon did not sit any throne, because there were none left worth sitting. He rode north and south, a black shadow across a sky that learned to welcome it. Sometimes he met Daenerys at some agreed-upon ridge, and they flew together in silence, and that silence said things neither of them could make words withstand. Sometimes they argued and used fire as a metaphor and then stopped themselves with laughter because they had the sense to know better. He loved her. Perhaps she loved him. It did not matter in the way old songs insist. It mattered in the way the weather matters, changing how you walk on any given day. Euron died as men like him do. Not in bed and not regretting enough. He tried one last time with his horn, this time putting his own mouth to it because even monsters learn, and the horn took him as payment for trying to rent gods by the hour. He dropped with his lungs shredded like sails, and the world became fractionally quieter. Stannis learned to be a steward in truth rather than in complaint. He found that justice is heavier than steel. He carried it anyway. Davos lived long enough to become that comedy. An honest man in a court who does not make a game of it. Sansa watched everything and wrote letters with a clarity that made liars cough. Arya went where maps do not agree and returned sometimes with a knife that had learned a new language. Bran saw what he would and kept most of it to himself and nearly all of it to the world. Tyrion drank less and spoke more precisely and learned joy the hard way, by permitting it to be small. Aemon died at last with a smile on his face and no envy in him, which is rare. Ghost grew old, which is to say he became more himself. He strutted down Winterfell's halls as if he had built them. He took to sleeping near the warmed stones where men sat to talk. He would open one red eye when Jon came in from flight and close it again with a sigh that might have been a benediction. Balerion slept sometimes beneath Winterfell and sometimes in caves along the sea dragon where the rock remembered the sea and the sea remembered when the rock had been thinner. When he flew, he carried the smell of iron and rain and old ash with him. When he landed, the earth admitted its smallness without shame. He allowed children to stand at the edge of his shadow and argue about whose father could lift the most grain. He tolerated no chains because some things teach by presence alone. Years later, in a spring so hesitant it might have been a lie trying itself out, Jon woke in the night with the certain knowledge that Balerion was leaving. Not leaving in a sulk. Leaving as a tide leaves when the moon has business elsewhere. He dressed quickly and went the yard wearing no name. Ghost followed, silent as a promise kept long since. He found Balerion where the dragon liked to lie and warm the stone for some reason of his own. The eye opened and found Jon the way a star will find a ship if the shipman knows the sky's old grammar. Where? Jon asked, though he knew the answer because men ask anyway when parting is at hand. South, said the heat in his bones. South to where the world broke and now is mending. South to a city that drowned and then drowned again in itself. South to where dragons were born from stone and sadness. Will you come back? Jon asked. I have always returned, the warmth said, which was not a yes and not a no but a truth so large it could be mistaken for either. Jon put his hand one last time to the ridge of plates just behind the angle of that enormous jaw. The heat filled him, and this time it was not power or command or colleagueship. It was farewell, unadorned. He leaned his forehead to the scale as one man does to another at the edge of a voyage. Go then, he said. There is a lot of world and not enough of you. Balerion rose without a sound. He gathered the yard into the curve of his wing and then let it go. He climbed until Winterfell was a pattern under snow and then until the snow itself lost detail. He went south, not fast, not slow, with the unarguable pace of a king leaving a hall to the men who have been taught how to speak to each other in it. Jon watched until he could not watch any longer for the tears, which embarrassed him and then did not, because some embarrassments are titles worth wearing. Ghost pressed his head into Jon's knee, and the warmth of it was a kind of throne. Jon put his hand to the direwolf's skull and laughed a little, and then did not, and breathed, and went inside to sleep the sleep of men who are tired and loved in exactly the right proportions. In the years that came, people told their children about the time the Black Dread came back and agreed to be a citizen among men for a while. They changed details the way people do. They gave Jon more sorrows and fewer jokes than he had, and Daenerys more fire and less patience, and Tyrion more laughter and less prayer, and Stannis more justice and no kindness. Ghost grew from a rumor into a story, into a boy's friend again. Aemon's name slid into the quiet that waits where good names go. Children traced with their fingers the fused glass down at Eastwatch and believed in things without being stupid about it. On some spring dawns, if you stood on the sea dragon point and watched the horizon very carefully, you could convince yourself you saw a black shape lift from a green-gray swell and move south toward a place where old cities wait under newer seas. On such mornings, the gulls were quieter without knowing why, and the fishermen lit their pipes with a care they otherwise did not bother with, and the world itself seemed, for a few breaths, to remember that it had been once peopled with wonders who did not ask permission to be wondrous. Jon lived on, and he did not become a story while he did. He aged, which is the most astonishing thing a hero can do. He limped sometimes from fights he had won by allowing something to be lost. He laughed in the right company and kept his counsel in the wrong. He learned to make peace as one learns a language, haltingly, with errors, patient with himself and others. He visited the wall for no reason other than to stand on it and feel the old cold in his teeth and look north and say to it without moving his lips, "We did this, you and I and a dragon and a girl and a boy and 1,000 others who would never be named." Once, when the wind was right, he thought he heard a sound from very far away, like a bellows filling, like a mountain remembering it had wings. He looked up. Nothing was there to certify his hope as fact. He smiled anyway. He scratched Ghost behind the ear where the old wolf had grown soft. He turned and went downstairs to the kitchen where men always talk better than they do in halls. He poured himself broth. He sat, somewhere far to the south, beyond the steppe where lost cities tell their own lies to grass, over the broken bridges that still teach rivers how to flow around them, beyond the smoking sea where the water remembers the shape of mountains. A black dragon flew low over a green island that had not seen such a shadow in 1,000 years. The cinder towers whispered, and something deep in the stone lifted its grief and let go. Balerion circled once and then went on. He did not need to land. He had done that already where it mattered. The world did not end. It remembered itself. It learned to carry both grief and joy without asking one to eat the other. The long night was a story men told their children not to make them afraid or brave, but to make them patient. They said, "Sometimes the world is too much for men, and sometimes men are exactly enough for it." They said, "A boy rode a dragon that had remembered himself, and together they burned a hole in the world large enough for spring to manage to put its foot through." They said, "Once we melted our chair and learned to speak standing." In Winterfell's gods would the heart tree watched seasons go with its red, unjudging eyes. It watched a man with streaks of white in his hair come and sit often and leave often. It watched a white wolf sleep with one ear half-cocked. It watched children play and take their own turns learning to be tall or not. It watched a sky that sometimes, when the clouds went their ways and the wind dug its elbows into the air, bore a shadow that made torches bend not in fear but in salute. On such days, some very old men would take off their caps and bow their heads, and some very young children would run and shout and throw themselves onto the ground to make angels in the snow, and the snow would accept their shapes and then let them go as the world does. And far off, a line of black upon blue would arc and diminish and go on, and those who loved it would not ask to keep it, because keeping is not the same as belonging, and they had learned, at last, the difference. By the time the snows receded from the barrows north of the Bar Rolands, the old roads began to lift their backs out of the ice like drowned men deciding to breathe. Carts creaked again along the Rose Road, laden not with soldiers and ashes but with salt fish, barley, wheels of hard cheese that clacked together like poor men's coins. Black gulls came up from the mouth of the Blackwater and screamed their simple gospel at the city they had never loved. The Red Keep had removed its crown of smoke. Stone dust filmed the cracked floors where the chair had wept itself away. Men discovered how to hold court on their feet and in their wits rather than on a pile of blades that pretended to be law. Cersei Lannister stood each morning in her broken hall as if presiding over the ruins of an idea. She dressed as finely as if fabric could argue with consequence. She did not drink for the first hour of the day. She took that hour like bitterness without wine. Tyrion brought the North their first honest tally of the city's hunger. He spoke on the steps of the ruined dragon pit with a parchment rolled under his hand like a weapon. The air up there smelled of dust and something older, a hint of chalk and bone, and there was a taste of far-off salt. "You cannot feed a city on memories," he said, pitched to Carrie. "You feed a city on carts that get through the gates without being burned. You feed it on boats that come up a river not lined with corpses. You feed it by convincing men that dying is not the only work left to them." Davos stood beside him. He had learned how to wear winter and speak to summer in the same breath. "We have fish. We have grain if the Riverlands remember how to be generous. We have a queen who understands that iron eats as well as gold. We have a dragon, which helps with more than war if you have the wit to use it." "Use," Sansa said afterward, in the ruins of a quiet room where dust had turned every horizontal surface into a page. "That is the word you cannot avoid and should not embrace. Use a dragon, and you will wake to find it has used you back." Jon kept his hands flat on the table as if paper's smoothness could remind them all how not to clench. "He is not a levy to be counted," he said. He still said he because calling Balerion it was like calling winter a pet. "The city needs something it can recognize," Tyrion said, watching Jon not with mockery, but with the care he reserved for men he had decided to like against his will. "Symbols are crude tools, but they stir tired hearts. When they see him up there," a tilt of his chin toward where the dragon pit's shadows cut the cloudy sky, "they believe, for 10 heartbeats, that we decided something permanent." "Nothing is," Davos said. "That's why we eat every day instead of once." They did not put Cersei in chains. Jon would not have it. Daenerys did not require it. Stannis mistrusted it only because a threat you could see was easier to manage than a threat dressed as a guest. She went under guard to the Tower of the Hand that no longer had a hand and looked out over the roofs and the river and the 1,000 lives between. Qyburn came and went with the polite smile of a man who inventoried calamity for a living. He avoided the dragon pit because he disliked being in the presence of animals he could not convert into instruments. That left the mountain and the man who had promised himself since childhood the right to hate him. The first time Clegane crossed the throne room's scorched threshold and smelled the iron tang that lives under cooked stone, he stopped abruptly enough that the boy carrying his shield bumped him. Sandor put his hand out without looking and the boy found his balance again, as if the hand had reached back years to catch him. Gregor stood in the dim like a slice cut out of shadow. He wore the yellow-white of Qyburn's art on his face where skin had forgotten its business. He turned and the last glint of sun off a window found nothing human to bless. Qyburn stepped forward. "There is no need," he began, and Sandor shouldered past him with the old honest contempt for needs that had justified themselves. The Hound did not make a speech. He said, "You," and the word had the weight of a boy's life and a man's scars. The mountain tilted his head a degree, as if listening for rain. They collided in a crash that made the broken thrones puddle sing under the dust. Sandor felt the strength in the other man's arms like the shocking return of a childhood nightmare you had thought yourself too old to fear. They broke benches. They put splinters into walls. The Hound's breath came harsh. It did not waste itself on being valiant. He ducked a swing that would have turned a smaller man into 2 smaller men. He rammed his shoulder under the bigger man's ribs and felt nothing there but the implacable duty of bone. He tore off the helm not for the face it would show but for the air it denied. The thing under the helm hissed and the smell was of rot and spice and stubborn tricks. Qyburn said something soothing to the wrong ears. Gregor backhanded him without looking and Qyburn upset in so neat a spill of bones and cloth that it would have pleased him for its symmetry if he had still been present enough to enjoy aesthetics. He struck the flagstones in an arrangement that meant the conversation had ended and the curiosity would not continue. Fires have their own will. Sandor had feared them as a boy, hated them as a man, and learned to live near them because the world is careless with our choices. Now there was a heap of brittle wood in the corner, broken chair legs, split banisters, a table's ribs. A fallen lantern rolled, spilled, took. Sandor felt the heat lap his cheek and his body remembered skin. It wanted to run. He made it stay. He made it go forward. He drove Gregor back the way you drive a bull into a pen that will not hold. He took the shoulder, he took the knee, he took the jaw, and did not count a victory he had not seen. They went together. When they fell into the part of the hall where the fire had eaten a path through old dust and leftover wine, and the flames took them without editorial. Sandor grinned once, quick as a boy stealing an apple, because it is not nothing to die choosing, and then the smoke put a hand over his mouth that did not remove it. The mountain made a sound like a house collapsing under snow, impersonal, thorough. Heat wrapped them both. Upstairs, a queen set down her cup after all and stood very straight while the floor told her this too was happening inside her house. For a day the city did not know how to grieve for a man most of it had learned to despise correctly, and a man many had never learned to despise correctly at all. Arya took the news as she had learned to take every loss that did not bear Jon's name. Like a sharp stone put into an old pocket, she walked the charred hall and stood where the heat had melted plaster into a sagged grin. "Well," she said to no one, "you got him." And there was no satisfaction in it, and there was enough. They assembled the lords and ladies who still had names worth sending on letters, and many who did not but had the grain. The dragon pit held them the way a dry bowl holds a cat. Reluctantly, amused, with an understanding that it is still the bowl. Yara Greyjoy came with sea in her hair and salt for a tongue and declared in her first breath that her islands would not pay for fires it had not lit. Arion Martell rode up with a banner of oranges and a look that said Dorne had spent its patience on other people's wars and had found the account unsatisfying. The Riverlands sent men with river mud on their boots and a habit of remembering who'd last burned their mills. The Vale came with feathers and courtesy. The Westerlands sent fewer lions than they owned since their gold had learned what holes look like. The Reach, shorn and cautious, chose their words like seeds. The Stormlands followed Stannis' shadow because that was what they had. He brought them in under obligation rather than persuasion. Daenerys stood without crown or chair. She did not beg. She did not burn. That discipline worked its own magic. Tyrion laid out a proposal as if he were dealing cards to men he had beaten once and hoped to beat again. A great council to choose a high steward with a term shorter than a lifetime and a power smaller than a god's. Regional houses to govern themselves with charters written in ink rather than blood. A Night's Watch remade as an order for scholars and scouts, and the truce with the free folk turned into honest citizenship rather than a line written on snow. "You want to trade a myth for an argument," Yara said, not displeased. "Good. We have always been better at arguments." "Dorne remains sovereign," Arion said, and kept her chin unbulled. "Fine," Tyrion said before anyone could make a poem of it. "Sovereign and bound by treaty. You like elegant phrasing. We will compose you elegant phrasing, and it will amount to this. When winter comes again, and it will, you will not find yourself alone with your pride and your sand." "The North," Sansa said, standing at Jon's shoulder and not behind him, "keeps its voice and its right to tell you no." Stannis cleared his throat with the sound of a saw biting into green wood. "If this council of yours chooses fools," he said, "I will not obey fools." "They will not be your masters," Davos said dryly. "They will be your neighbors. I find both arrangements barely tolerable, for different reasons." They argued until the sun made their shadows long and thin as spears on the ground. They ate standing. They did not, that day, sing. In the end, because men must break bread or bone to feel they have chosen, they held up hands, and a rough eyes and rougher nays rattled around the stones like thrown pebbles. Enough agreed to make the rest honest. "Who?" Yara asked, blunt as moored chain. "Who is your first steward?" Tyrion looked right at Stannis, which was bold, and then at Daenerys, which was wiser, and then at Jon, which was victory. "Not him," he said cheerfully of Jon before the murmurs could ferment. "He will only refuse and we will lose time." "Stannis then," someone said, half in mischief and half in hope of seeing a thing made simple by hardness. Stannis did not look surprised. "I will take the work," he said, "and not the flattery. Call me what you like if the carts run and the walls hold. But I will accept a term and a clerk who writes in a hand legible enough that even a farmer can read." "You may also have a hand," Davos said. "I know a man who owes you almost more honesty than he can pay." Stannis' mouth twitched, which for him was the flourish with which lesser men sign their names. "Very well." Daenerys stepped forward and relieved everything of its standoff by speaking plainly. "I will not be your queen," she said. "I will be your ally. There is work east of the sea that still belongs to me like an unfinished sentence. I will finish it and return when I am needed or wanted. And in the meantime your steward will call on my voice when his own will not carry." "Will you take your dragons?" asked some lordling whose name had already fallen out of the air. "I will," she said. "You cannot ask a mother to leave her children and then pretend you are not asking for a death she will not oblige." Jon said nothing until the dust of new law had begun to settle into joints where it might hold. He found Daenerys on a high balcony that looked over roofs pricked with scaffold and lines hung with washing. She had unbound her hair. The wind moved it a little and then thought better. Drogon was a black curve on the broken hill, and Rhaegal crawled his circles, healing, stubborn. Viserion watched the river like a boy watches a bright knife. "It will not feel like victory," she said without turning. "No," Jon said. "It will feel like waking at the hour you hope to go on sleeping and finding the house still stands and the soup pots still hot." She looked at him then, measuring both of them against a sky that did not choose sides. "Come east," she said. "If I go now," he said, and did not flinch from the look her eyes made of him, "I will start a quarrel you do not need between men who have barely learned not to kill for the sport of it. Let your work be itself. Let mine be here. Then, when the houses are standing without me in the doorway, I will come." She put a hand to the stone and tapped once, gently, as if accepting the terms of a contract not written. "You will," she said, "or you won't. The world is too large to make oaths that stretch across it." They did not kiss. They did not need to make anything that might break. She descended, and the city let her pass with the half-reluctant respect it gives to anyone who can command a shadow that big. When the sails pulled out from Blackwater Bay 3 weeks later, the harbor was ringed not with jeers or cheers, but with a quiet that felt like a prayer not addressed to a god, but to competence. Ghost came south with Jon that first season because the direwolf had decided city smells were not beneath his dignity if his boy was snarled in them. Children learned fast not to put their hands out for that white head. They learned also to leave meat on the steps and run away giggling to be brave in private. Ghost took it all with the indifferent royalty of old dogs and old kings. Tyrion made himself the unpleasant kind of useful. He taught scribes to be honest by boring them efficiently. He set clerks to counting coin and grain with the kind of patience that makes dishonest men sigh and resign. He dealt with sells words like a tavern keeper, not insulting them with trust, not insulting them with distrust, always making sure they had the right idea about which door to leave by. Stannis spent 3 days a week with the common folk in the shadow of what had been the Great September, listening to disputes about wells and roofs and fences. He did not enjoy it. He did not refuse it. He weighed and he chose and he ordered the thing written. When a slumlord protested, Stannis said, "It is not a bribe if it is called a tax," and collected. Davos smiled behind his beard and arranged for a pot of stew to be kept by the door of the hall all day, so that those who came for justice left with at least one kind of comfort. Sansa wrote letters. She sent them to every keep where she had a claim on a memory. She did not threaten. She invited, cajoled, shamed, offered example. Grain moved. So did trust, as much as trust ever moves in men who count their lineage like coins. The north grew quieter. The cold withdrew with the slow grace of an old general won to armistice. Tormund came grinning out of a spring mist with a band of free folk and a gift that was not traditional. A sheaf of crudely scratched stories about a time a white wolf had stood on a ridge and refused to leave a man to die merely because dying seemed likely. "For your singers," he told Sansa. "They think too hard." Arya left again before the heat could decide if it would truly return. She went west with a ship that wanted to see if the world ended in a seam or in a fold. She left one knife with Sansa and one with Jon and one nowhere to be found, which suited her. She promised to come back from the places where maps turned fanciful if she found milk worth boiling and stories worth bringing. She did not promise else. Bran sat under the heart tree and did work that did not require the company of men. He went into birds when the mood took him and into wolves and once, carefully, into the mind of a humpbacked whale that moved along the narrow sea like a slow mountain. He saw cities as a scatter of lights at night like coins cast on a black table. He saw, now and then, a black speck far south make its own weather over dull water, and his mouth twitched in a private amusement that had nothing to do with the affairs of kings. Melisandre lasted longer than any woman so passionately certain ought. She spent a winter in the north and did not wither. She spent a spring in King's Landing and did not set it on dramatic fire. She came to Winterfell in a summer so pale it apologized for itself and asked to be left alone for a day in the Godswood. She sat with the weirwood's red tears on her brow, and there she took the ruby from her neck. It went dark like a word forgotten. She breathed twice, 3 times, with the deliberate calm of a woman who has lived every breath wanting something else. Her hair went white in a wash and then thin. Her skin softened and slipped. She could not rise and did not try. Jon found her just after the light took on that golden sadness it wears in the last hour. He covered her and did not call for anyone. The leaves moved. The tree's face did not change, but the scents around it did. An acknowledgement that a long quarrel had decided its own end without asking men for permission. He buried her beneath the roots with care that surprised even him and said no words into air, reserving them for what does not need ears. He poured a jug of clean water as if making tea for a neighbor whose garden fence had always been troublesome but who had lately shared apples. The first dream came 2 summers later, not like the storm-hewn summons whose heat had almost dragged him south when Euron blew his black horn, but like the remembered smell of a house where you were a child. He woke with old ash in his nose and knew where Balerion had gone. The old stories of the Doom keep themselves adjusted to men who hear them. Sometimes demon fire, sometimes angry gods, sometimes the earth shaking off a bad idea it had dallied with too long. Jon did not argue with old stories. He set about gathering men who could make new ones without delusion. Davos insisted on coming and then pretended not to have insisted. Always wanted to see the end of the world, he grumbled, packing salt pork and good rope and the maps of men who had not come back. Find it and call it a cape. Tyrion came because you cannot keep him from the most dangerous room in any house that interests him. He brought parchment and 2 bottles of wine too young to have opinions. Missandei volunteered, and then withdrew the word volunteer, and replaced it with decide. There are older tongues there, she said, and stones that remember. Sometimes they speak. Grey Worm measured the risks like a farmer testing earth with his fingers. He declined to go. He sent men he trusted to follow any order not to be fools. They took a ship out of Dragonstone that had been built by a woman who put extra ribs in as a matter of temperament. The smoking sea lay sullen under a sky that could not decide between clear and veiled. Sulphur rode every breath with a rider's saddle soreness. The water moved not with waves but with cramps. The men on deck did not sing. They watched the horizon as if expecting the world to produce a face. The oarsmen kept count under their breath, each man a metronome for his own courage. Balerion found them before night. He came out of the western glow like an opinion the day had taken too long to express. He circled once and the ship's planks creaked, as if remembering forests and wind and better company. He came lower and the heat he carried made red ghosts in the air. Jon stood on the foredeck with one hand on the rail and the other on Ghost's ruff. Ghost did not growl. There are moments you do not announce yourself. The ruins of Valyria lay ahead like the bones of a whale that had tried to beach itself and ended up the shore instead. Towers leaned without having learned how to fall. The water ran in green fingers into streets that had been roads. Bridges went halfway and then thought better. Here and there a smear of fire burned without the courtesy of fuel. The smell was of the inside of the earth and old iron, and the seas hurt. Out of the water a thing broke surface like a carp made of glass and anger. Balerion turned his head, and it did not surface again. They made land on a slab of fused stone that might once have been a square where men traded cinnamon and cruelty. The sand around it had a tendency to turn to glass under your step, with a delicate cling to your boots. "Don't touch anything that touches back," Davos said through his scarf, which he had tied to keep a leaf in his lungs. "And don't bring home souvenirs unless you intend to die of them." Missandei found writing. It ran around a broken pillar in a ribbon, fine and stark. Its strokes so clean they hardly took dust. She put her fingers near and then thought better. "The grammar is wrong in a way that suggests it is right for what it is trying to do," she murmured, eyes half-lidded. "They spoke like men who had made themselves gods and then learned that gods have the poorest options." Tyrion crouched, peering. "Do they say, 'Please go away'?" "They say," Missandei answered after a beat in which she listened with more than ears. "We opened the mountain and found our own hunger there." They say, "We taught stone to catch fire and called it peace." They say, "We learned that the thing inside the world is not our pet." "Wise," Tyrion said. "Late." The city did not lure them in. It had no need. Its gravity lay not in seduction but in the implacable shape of what it had been. They advanced in slow, careful order, Balerion on their left like a moving knight. Jon walked with his palm occasionally touching the plates along that massive shoulder, less to steer than to show. Here, together, through. Ghost flowed like water where a wolf should not be, and if a thing long and pale and full of teeth lifted from a culvert and scented him, it reconsidered. On one bridge, a cluster of small stone men lay in attitudes of sleep. On another, a woman held the melted memory of a harp beneath her arm. Davos put a biscuit near her feet, which was foolish and appropriate. They came to the place where the ground had split long ago and learned to breathe lava. The air went thin and thick, alternating. The heat rose in sentences. Declaration, question, pause. Balerion stood at the edge and peered into the wound with the casual interest any predator shows another's lair. The glow from below kissed his belly, and for a moment Jon saw old scars there, near invisible under the new gloss of health. Pale lines where once in a Targaryen lifetime he had gone down into the same hell and met something that left a mark. The story came up the back of Jon's neck unbidden. Of Arya, a girl who took what she wanted and brought back enough of it to die of. He put a hand flat on warm scale and did not ask questions the dead could not answer. Missandei stood and spoke not to gods or dragons but to the air. "If the old language has ears, hear this," she said. "We returned what you took. You may keep your pride. We will keep our people." The lava popped once, the lazy, disdainful, approving sound a large animal makes when it cannot be bothered to rise. That night they camped where once a courtyard had held a hedge of singing trees. The trees were glass. The stars above them seemed closer than in the north, which was a lie and true. Tyrion wrote notes. At one point he raised his head and found Jon looking at the glow to the south where the volcanoes wore their veils. "You do not think you will die," Tyrion said. He said it without envy. "I remember that I will," Jon said. "That keeps the thinking straight." "I was wrong about one thing," Tyrion said after a pause in which he arranged the sentence better. "More than one, but this in particular. Sometimes you break a symbol and something better comes to stand where it stood. Not because you told it to, but because men find their own spines when you tidy away the crutches." "You did the tidying," Jon said, half-smile automatic and not unkind. "We did," Tyrion corrected. He corked his ink as if capping an emotion. In the first hour before dawn, when even volcanoes drowse, Balerion left the square and moved into the southern dark. He had not asked leave. Jon rose and followed because that is what you do when your friend goes on feet bigger than houses. The dragon walked the old road where studs of obsidian still marked out lanes like pearls on a drowned girl's neck. He went to a low place where heat pooled. He lowered his head and exhaled, not in fury but in some older generosity. The ground answered. A vein of light moved under their boots like a snake deciding directions. The air held its breath and then let it go. "What are you doing?" Jon asked aloud, acquainting himself with the taste of being human in the presence of a thing that remembered making humans crouch and squint. He knew, though, as soon as he asked. In the north, they had torn a hole to let heat up and end a cold that would not relent. Here, the dragon was teaching a wound to scab. The doom had been an ending thrown open too far. Balerion walked the edges and licked them shut. A softness came into Jon's chest that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with awe. You can break the world, and you can mend it, and mending is slower and steadier and requires a pride that knows how to bow. They stayed 7 days because 7 made the men who came with them feel they had completed a sacred math. They collected nothing but knowing. They took precautions against every sickness they had been warned of and against some invented at midnight to give worry somewhere to go. They wrote little. They remembered much. When they went, Valyria did not call them back. Balerion rose off a slab that had once held an emperor's bath and shook ash from his wings like an animal shedding snow. The city did not look smaller from above. It looked exactly the size of men's mistakes. On the return voyage, a storm came up quick as a thrown plate, broad and low and resentful. The sea staggered under it. The ship began that creaking complaint which is not panic but a series of negotiations. This rib will hold if that beam does. This sail will rip if that line is not cut in the next 10 breaths. Davos moved as if ship and man had been carved of the same sense. "Pull," he told the sea, and it did, and the ship did not consent to be taken. The storm bruised them and forgot them. They came clear with the taste of copper in their mouths and the kind of relief that makes laughter too easy and tears too near. Tyrion drank the good wine and pretended it was bad. When they made Dragonstone, the gulls looked offended at the company. Rhaegal lay with one wing stretched and one tucked like a man reading poorly. Viserion watched their approach and trilled an impatience that spoke of Missandei's absence before he saw her on the deck waving. Drogon was gone east with Daenerys. Balerion landed on the old basalt and steamed the rain off the walls. The castle held him as well as any place could hold a mountain that moved. They went north by stages. Men in inns wanted stories and were surprised when the stories were mostly of heat and old writing and wounds that could be taught to close. "No monsters?" a boy asked, disappointed to discover that his appetite had outpaced the world's supply. "Some," Davos admitted, "but we weren't their meals because we had better sense than to pretend we were heroes." The Great Council in King's Landing wrote Valyria down as a thing to remember occasionally, like an old debt forgiven but not forgotten. The stewards of the treasury did not argue for expeditionary mine shafts. The city had been reminded of where greed leads when it meets geology. Scribes revised maps with an extra squiggle, purely for precision. Sailors added a line to their songs: "Steer wide of the city that breathes." News came from the east with the regularity of seasons when seasons behave. Daenerys made an example of 3 slavers who had decided every quiet was an invitation. She did not burn them. She undid their deals in public and gave their ledgers to their competitors. She sat in plazas without throne or pyramid and asked women what would keep their sons off ships. Missandei wrote those answers down and did something with them. The kind of quiet work no hero reads a song about and all heroes rely upon. Grey Worm built companies of men who did not believe in the lash and taught them how to move together so well no lash would ever tame them again. Ravens brought Rhaegal's health in ink and Rhaegal himself when the sky was kind. He came across the narrow sea like a green idea and shared the Dragonstone courtyard with the black shadow of a creature older than any courtyard. They tolerated each other with a courtesy that boded well for nations. Jon did not count years the way bookmen do. He marked them by harvest smells, and the way's ghost went gray around the muzzle, and the mornings when he woke with the weight of a life pressing his ribs in gratitude rather than dread. He went to the wall when it pleased him and walked its height with the men who kept its books. He met Tormund under the old pines and drank something that had a berry in it and a habit of improving conversation. He helped haul boats up on stony beaches at Eastwatch because sometimes a man's hands should learn again what they nearly forgot. He visited Winterfell often and learned to be in rooms where Sansa made law with a pen like a sword and Bran watched law become weather. He sat in kitchens and tasted potatoes the way old men do, with appreciation disproportionate and well-earned. He taught boys to polish steel and girls to shoot, and he swapped those lessons when it was useful to confuse habit. Stannis aged into the kind of hard man other men came to for fairness because he would not sell it. Davos grew a belly and a collection of sayings the way other men grow gardens. Tyrion learned to tell jokes in which the clever person was not always himself. The city forgot, by degrees, that it had once expected to burn every decade. It learned to expect taxes instead. Cersei Lannister lived long enough to observe the fruits of these embarrassments. She kept her hair short and her vices disciplined. Once, when the heat settled as tight as a helm and the flies made a low choir that had not read any hymnal, she summoned Tyrion to the high terrace that had once looked down upon a court of magnificence and now looked down upon a market that had opinions. She poured him wine and poured none for herself. "Do you think," she asked, "that I lost because I was a woman or because I was wrong?" "Men lose for both reasons," he said. "So do women. In your case, you were wrong, and then you were a woman and you drank too much to pick the order." She laughed once, the real laugh of a person who has found the joke that includes her. "If I had had your head," she said, "and his back." She nodded toward the empty yard where, to both their surprise, memory raised Jaime's ghost with nothing but air to lift it. "I would have eaten this world." "You tried," he said gently. "It gave you indigestion." A year later she died, not in drama but in consequence. A fever took her and did not bother to negotiate. Qyburn was not there to overrule any honest god with neatness. Jon did not attend her funeral. Tyrion did. He stood in a room too warm for a body and looked at the face that had expected thrones and found nothing now but a clean cloth and the courtesy of closure. "You were not all wrong," he said to the heir, because it was easier than making the admission to anyone living. "We just needed a smaller kind of right." Jon heard of her passing while he was on the sea road between White Harbor and Barrowton. He looked out at the gray water shouldering itself against shingle and said nothing. He remembered her as a sharp smell. He remembered the melted chair. He remembered a boy hiding in a stable overhearing a queen's laughter and deciding what would be safe to say that day and what would kill him. He kept these and let the rest wash. The thought came less often now and more quietly. That winter would return and find them unready. That the Night King would have been merely one shape cold can put on when it wants to be convincing. In the 7th year after the breaking of the throne, snow fell strange in Dorne for half a day and melted on the sand like spilled milk. In the 9th, a summer storm thrashed the arbor and left behind a stink in the fish and a taste in the wine. Stannis made men write these things down. Bran watched the lines on the page and added others you could not write. A river's sudden decision to alter its bed. A mountain's subtle lifting. A bird that ceased to come because the insects it ate did not. Balerion flew less, or perhaps the world noticed him less. When he did come, it was like a benign eclipse. A shadow men shaded their eyes to greet rather than to fear. Children pointed. Farmers calculated whether rain would follow. Sometimes it did, though dragons are not weathermen. When he landed in Winterfell's yard, the stones remembered him and grew warm for days afterward. An old kindness murmured between granite and God. One spring, when the apple trees shivered themselves into white foam, a band of sellswords came up the king's road under new banners with old intent. They wanted coin rather than power and could not see the map that connected the one to the other. They set fire to 2 farms when the coin did not come quickly enough to convince them. Jon met them in a field bright with dandelions, that coarse, insolent yellow the poor call lion. 𝒔. He brought 100 men and 1 direwolf. He did not bring Balerion. There are days you do not move mountains. He spoke first and made it so clear he had done the arithmetic that the captain sighed and tried to make it a salvageable conversation. "You've got the look of a man who has been in enough trouble to be bored by ours," the captain said, amused by his own frankness. "I've been in enough trouble to recognize it," Jon said. "You can leave with your lives and your boots and the weapons you can carry. You can't leave with our food. You can't leave with our children. And if you decide to test the math, know that the sum has been done in winter, and winter writes a particular sum." They tried him anyway because men do, and the field learned the taste of iron again. Ghost moved like the idea of snow across their flank. Jon did the work cleanly and apology did not enter into it. When it ended, 5 men lay in dandelions never to rise, and the captain limped away with his men's eyes heavy on his back. In the evening Jon ate bread with the farmers whose coops had charred, and he took a blackened beam in his hand and helped lift what could be lifted. He slept on straw that stuck like stubborn memories and woke with a rooster swearing at dawn. He laughed into his arm quietly and went to work. As for Arya, the sea made itself her tutor and her enemy, and her only friend worth the name when the weather turned perverse. She returned after a year with a scar down her forearm and a skiff painted with claw marks and a story about a fog that moved like a herd of white cattle. She gave Sansa a little carved bird from a place that smelled of cloves. She gave Jon a rope that had been braided by girls with hands scarred from fishing. She gave Bran a new set of eyes by telling him how a horizon looks when no land interrupts. Then she was off again because some fathers never learn. The world felt more itself simply knowing she walked it. That autumn, Jon dreamed again, but there was no heat in it. He stood in Winterfell's yard, and the trees were full of ravens that did not speak with a boy's voice, and the air had that felt absence it carries on the day after a fair. Balerion came down slow. He looked at Jon, and in the big dark of his eye there was not command or question but something like request. "All right," Jon said, aloud in the dream and then aloud when he woke, forgetting he was alone. Ghost lifted his head and snorted, and Jon scratched the soft place behind an old ear. They left 2 mornings later, easy as men leaving to inspect a ditch. He took no train. He left no order that was not already implicit in living. He rode out with Ghost and a pack that held a cloak and a dry loaf and a flask against the kind of weather you pretend will not come. Balerion found them beyond the last of the stone fences, where the land relaxes into its own shape. Jon climbed without ceremony and without the tremor in his thighs that had accompanied the first days. He settled, and the old music began in his bones. They flew not south or east but west, where the sunset has always practiced its larger ideas. They crossed the cold bright channel. They moved over isles where the wind keeps its own accounts in granite. They came to a sea that ran from gray to black under a sky that denied poems about blue. They went on. The world grew empty in the way that liberates thought or starves it. Jon counted nothing. He watched Balerion's shoulders and the way the wind wrote itself on water. He slept once strapped in and woke with frost on his lashes and a kind of happiness that people who have not flown mistake for pain. Land came up at last like the back of a whale breathing. It stretched low and far. Trees crouched. The grass lay along the ground as if the wind had taught it manners. They came down on a rise where stones stood in a circle like men who hadn't agreed and had long since fallen silent in their disagreement. The air had a taste of peat and of a smoke not long extinguished. Ghost leapt lightly down and trotted in a wide ring. He put his nose down and came up with a startled sneeze when the scent gave him nothing he could name. Balerion folded himself. A black bishop laid aside in a game that had outgrown boards. Jon walked the ring and laid hands on Old Grey, the rough skin of history where lichens made a slow painting. He felt no magic he would swear to. He felt the reassurance of anything that outlasts men without sneering at them for being brief. A woman came out of the turf as if the hill had birthed her. She wore a dress the color of rainwater and hair long as a meadow. She was beautiful in the way any living thing is beautiful when it is wholly occupied with itself without vanity. She looked at Balerion and down again at the earth the way you look at 2 friends who do not require introduction. "You brought him," she said to Jon in a voice like the back of a cave receiving the sea. "He brought me," Jon said. She nodded as if the distinction mattered to people even if it did not matter to hills. "Our fires have been poor. Your great friend carries a memory of how to lay them." She looked at his sword hilt, at the fur at his shoulders, at his north in his hair. "And you carry a memory of how to end a winter without throwing everything into the mouth of spring." "Who are you?" Jon asked, and did not expect her to say, "I am the queen of the westernmost isle, and you will bring me barrels of oat." "Nobody you need to name," she said serenely. "But 10 generations from now someone will, if we stay. We will build different mistakes than you did. That is the best any of us can do, I think." He almost laughed and stopped because there was respect to be paid to whatever once was sacred here. "We can help you lay the fire," he said simply. Balerion stood with a huff and moved with the quiet of an old harbor under fog. He walked the ring and traced a path with his heat not on the stones but in the ground that had forgotten its own veins. The woman closed her eyes and put her hands out and felt, and smiled like a girl given back something she thought an elder had lost and not told her about out of shame. The air sweetened, just slightly. The soil sighed, just once. Ghost sat and tried to pretend this was boring because the way his heart surged when the earth told its secrets embarrassed him. They stayed that night and listened to people sing in a language Jon could almost understand if he listened as a boy does to older cousins. He slept on a skin and woke with a blanket over him he had not pulled. In the morning, Balerion was gone. He had taken nothing and had not said goodbye in any human sense. He had said it by the manner of his departure. Not rushed, not regretful, a continuation that relied upon trust. Jon went back by shorter ways than he had gone. That is not magic. That is how knowing works. He came down in the yard at Winterfell and Ghost spiraled him like a white ribbon, and the kitchen sent him a bowl of stew so immediately that there must have been someone looking at the sky out of habit. He ate. He slept in his own bed. He woke to the ordinary miracle of a roof. Years went on being themselves. Children born in the black years grew into men who could joke about them. Some of the jokes were good. The songs invented in the drunkest halls about the melting of the throne grew better after the first wave of obvious metaphors had been flogged to death. Davos sayings got longer until boys used them to measure rope. Stannis' hair went from iron to the color of old slate, and he learned to say, "I was wrong" quickly when necessary, which meant he said it less often than you'd think. Tyrion taught law as if it were a craft like joinery. Sansa had a white streak at her temple that suited the way she raised an eyebrow when men tried to sell her nonsense at market price. Bran's eyes looked farther away and more present at once. Arya sent a piece of a shell from a place that had no name but the one she had given it, and the letter that wrapped it was 2 lines of pure delight that had somehow learned to write itself down. Ghost died on a day when the sky did him the favor of being as white as he had been. He lay his head down in the warm place between the benches in the hall where he liked to warm his old bones, and he exhaled with a sound Jon had heard many winter nights, a satisfied complaint against age. Jon went down on the rushes beside him and put his hand on the narrow bridge of that skull and said into that ear the words he had never spoken because men do not think to say them to the ones who never left. "Thank you for choosing me." They buried him under the elm in the east corner of the yard where the dogs went to gossip in summer. Sansa set a plate of cold pork on the grave that night because rituals appear where they have been needed all along. Ravens came and considered and left it alone. After that, Jon rode Balerion less not because the joy dwindled but because joy had learned to share itself out among simpler things. He found himself content to walk a mile and call that miracle enough for a day. He took a child from his saddle when the child's father's hands shook from a night shift at the gate. He cut wood. He sat out in the rain under the lip of a shed roof and smelled the world return to itself. He grew old in the honest way, which is to say he stopped being shocked by his reflection. When the last winter before his bones began to ache in earnest rolled its white out of the north, he went to the wall and watched the weather take itself seriously again. He stood on the broad back of ice and tasted the old iron in the air and did not hate it. The watchmen had learned to be readers, and they showed him the careful scripts where they wrote what they saw: moss thickness, owl counts, the color of morning frost. He praised their penmanship with severity, as a kindness, and on a day of pale blue cold when the sun wore a halo as if showing off its old tricks, a shadow went over the ice and the torches slanted and Jon lifted his face and felt the expensive happiness that hurts as much as it heals. Balerion came down lower than courtesy required and banked once, as if remembering the exact angle of the first time they had turned on this wind. Jon laughed like a boy, and if his knee twinged when he climbed, the memory of every other climb was balm. He settled. Heat nestled in his joints. They went. Men in the yard below pointed and set down buckets. A boy dropped a broom and did not fetch it. A girl climbed onto a barrel as the sensible way to grow taller for a moment. A baker put his hands on his hips and grinned into the sky because the world had decided, unexpectedly, to be charming on a day when his bread had refused to rise. A raven flapped hard and then did not bother, letting the wind carry it. The wall sang its thin string song, that tuning note it keeps for the faithful. They flew out above the white and above the old slow ranks of fur. They looked down at nothing that needed killing. They looked down at everything that needed tending. They went up into air that cleared their heads without asking their permission. This time Jon did not think of thrones or winters won or laws made. He thought of nothing. He belonged to nothing. He belonged entirely. When they came down, bad soup tasted better than feasts. He took his cloak off slow and folded it as if specific to ritual. He went to bed when the dark said so and woke before it asked. He lived another portion of his life like that, in proper meals, in repairing hinges, in talking to men who needed talking to, and in being quiet when quiet had the better of it. And when he died, old as a peasant gets away with sometimes, with the warmth of a hearth on his face and the sound of someone chopping wood somewhere, as if time had chosen to continue without dramatic announcements, Winterfell did what it has always done for its dead. The crypts took him. The stone made room. The dire wolves carved along that aisle did not move. If one thought it did, it was only the eye making sense of a grief that liked to feel seen. Sansa wept once, not because she had been surprised, but because surprise is often kinder than the knowledge that comes on schedule. Arya came from wherever the maps have stopped and stood with her hair full of wind and did not wipe her cheeks. Bran closed his eyes and did not go anywhere. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Some time after that, perhaps years or days. Men are poor with measures when they are busy living. On a slate morning when rain came in veils and drifted off the roofs like ghosts with little to do, a shadow rolled over the yard. People came to the doors as they always did for this. Balerion circled once and then came down not into the yard but beyond the walls, where the stubby pines huddle and the ground is soft with needles. He lay there the way mountains lie, convincingly permanent. He lifted his head and the eye looked on the stone where men had set a marker with a simple name. The eye took that in and the rain made tiny rivers along his plates. He did not roar. He exhaled, long and low, and steam moved over the pine trunks. He let his head down on the earth. The earth accepted it as it accepts everything. He lay like that while the rain found places between his plates to wash. A boy crept close enough to see his own face enormous and reversed in the dragon's eye and ran back because that kind of knowledge is dear. By noon, the shadow did not move. By evening, men understood without anyone saying a word that the oldest hunger had decided it was full. They did not bury him. You do not bury mountains. You live around them. Children grew up with a black hill beyond the eastwood and learned to walk by running their hands along the plates, feeling the ridges, falling and learning to get up. In spring, the needles that fell on him steamed in the first warmth and made a smell that was added to the collection of scents the mind calls home. Birds nested in the creases and sang songs that mispronounced the names of kings. Sometimes on a day, the city down south thought itself the whole of the world. A shadow of that old shadow would pass in a cloud and the air would tilt and men would set their hands on their tables and feel the house admit it, the way houses admit thunder. If no shadow came, they felt it anyway. It is like that with things that have left you better than they found you. The absence weighs as much as the presence, but it does not crush. The wall kept its ice and its books. The Night's Watch learned to tell a new generation that their black cloaks were uniforms for remembering rather than for dying. The Dothraki learned ships as if ponies could be taught to float. The free cities learned that you cannot build prosperity on men whose spines you have removed. It collapses like a tent in wind. Small folk learned that taxes are better than torches and that a high steward who listens is a good enough king for a weekday. In the north, men remembered to look up on clear nights because sometimes a streak of black rose out of the east and became nothing, and it was well to salute. And if now and then a rider came down out of the high white in a dream, hair blown back, eyes squinting in the thin air, along the spine of a creature that was not gone but everywhere, that was not a lie. It was the world, telling itself the true story the long way around. It was the counterpsalm to the old cold song. It was the proof that you can survive the weather of history and decide, afterward, to plant beans and mend harness and teach your children to spit with accuracy and kindness. In the crypts, The kings held their stone swords and the carved wolves put their paws on their paws, calm and without complaint. The air down there tasted of old earth and small water and iron. If you went down with a candle and a question, you would come up with your question unchanged and a steadier hand to carry it. Somewhere, far off, under another sky, rain fell in sheets and a black island shrugged. In the east, in a city that had once had reason to be afraid of chairs, a brown woman wrote a law that made it less likely a boy would be sold and more likely he would take up a trade and be hilariously bad at it for 2 years and then suddenly good. The North took its winters as they came. The South took its summers without apology. Dorne chose when to involve itself with admirable exactitude. The Vale clung to its Ares and kept birds fat. The Riverlands learned to accept that bridges sometimes wash out and you build them again. The Reach forgave slowly and baked bread while forgiving. The Ironborn discovered, over 2 generations of stubbornness and laughter, that raiding can be turned sideways into fishing if you point the boats in a new direction and have the wit to be proud of a different sort of daring. And men told the story of the day the Black Dread carried a Stark on his back out of Winterfell's crypts, and they burned a hole right through the world, and they melted a chair, and they did not then become gods. They remained men. They married badly or well. They made chairs that moved and laws that could be edited. They died when it was time and not infrequently thereafter. Some claims went quiet and some grew quietly. The songs improved, as songs do when no one is in a hurry and everyone is eating. If you stood, taking your time about it, under the eaves of the Eastwood when the first snow came and lay your hand on the cool, hard curve of old scale, you felt something like the hum you hear in your skull when the wind is correct, when the world arranges itself nearer to the right angle. You could call it memory. You could call it gratitude. The people who lived there called it by no name and taught their children to listen for it. If the children asked where it came from, the parents pointed in all directions. Once in a very great while, long after the men in this story had made the most of their briefness and yielded up their names to the places they had loved, a black line would lift against the blue far, far to the south, so small you could not be sure you had seen it except for the way the gulls went still. It would resolve or it would not. No one climbed a hill to try to see it longer. They had learned enough about wonder to let it go when it wanted. And Winterfell held, and the Wall did, and a world that had survived fire and dark and the arrogance that pretends to domesticate them made a habit of tending itself with more patience than before, which is the nearest thing to victory men need if they intend to go on.